This episode is brought to you by Christendom, a big tent platform for Catholic content creators. Say goodbye to endlessly browsing for Catholic content. At Christendom, we make it simple to follow, share, and save your favorite creators' content. Join our community at christendom.app. It's free.
Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, the editor of Crux, and your host here on Last Week in the Church, the show where we harvest the fruits of the last week of journalism on the Vatican and the global church beat and try to serve you up steaming and piping hot a dish of the best selections that we've got. Now, normally we do 4 or 5 different stories, but of course this week there really is only one story. So this week I'm bringing to you our election special. And our catch line this week is, he's back. Donald Trump, just when you thought he was out of the picture, just when you thought he was down for the count, he is back as the president-elect of the United States. We are going to break down several dimensions of the 2024 election results, beginning with the implications for the Catholic vote and the political role of the Catholic community in America, then the fallout for U.S.-Vatican relations during Trump's second non-consecutive term, third, how the big picture dynamics might be ameliorated to some extent by retail-level concerns, and then finally, we'll try to inject a dose of perspective as to why the outcomes of elections are sometimes less dramatic, less all-encompassing than you might think. All that and more is waiting for you on this edition of Last Week in the Church, so please do not go anywhere. Do not change that dial. Don't get up for a snack. Don't go walk the dogs. Don't do anything. Stay where you are, because I will be right back. All right, everybody. Well, look, unless you have been living under a rock or in a coma for the last little while, you already know that Donald Trump defeated Kamala Harris and has been reelected as president of the United States for a non-consecutive term. And, as a result, the Donald is back on the saddle. And commentators, pundits, analysts around the world have spent the last week trying to make sense of all of this. This week on this show, we're going to try to see all of this through a Catholic lens. So let us begin with the implications of all of this for kind of the political profile of Catholics in America. At Crux, we interviewed one expert on polling this week who, looking at the exit polls of Catholic voters after this election, declared that the real significance of the 2024 election is that it has consolidated, ratified, affirmed, maybe put an exclamation point on white Catholics as now a reliable Republican GOP voting bloc. Now, in some ways, you might profitably ask the question, did we really need 2024 to do that? I mean, if we go back to the year 2000, okay, so that was the first George Bush campaign. We're talking about almost a quarter century ago, 24 years ago. We're talking about a period of time that encompasses 7 different presidential elections. White Catholics have always voted in a majority for the Republican candidate. I mean, for instance, George Bush in his first election in 2000 got 52% of the white Catholic vote. In 2004, he got 56% of the white Catholic vote. And by the way, in that election, his opponent was John Kerry, a Roman Catholic. And yet, nevertheless, George Bush prevailed. We flash forward to the 3 different elections now when Donald Trump has been on the ballot. In 2016, Donald Trump got 64% of the white Catholic vote. That is still the high watermark for Republican candidates. In 2000, facing Joe Biden, that dipped to 57%. And then this time against Kamala Harris, he rebounded to 61%. I mean, the basic conclusion here is that if we look at recent experience, what we can say is that in general, the white Catholic vote has been for some time and increasingly is a reliably Republican constituency. I mean, I would point out, for instance, that in 2012, this is in the pre-Donald Trump era, Mitt Romney got 59% of the white Catholic vote against Barack Obama. That, of course, was in the wake of contraception mandates controversy as part of Obama's healthcare reform plan. My point is this, that as we survey the landscape of different American political constituencies, I think we can now say that white Catholics are GOP voters. Now, here's what makes all that important. Historically, what we have said is that if we look at different religious constituencies in America, most of them are clearly politically identified. That is, we've long said that Jews, African American Christians, mainline Protestants, they were reliable Democratic voters, kind of always have been. If we look at evangelical Christians, Pentecostals, those are reliable Republican voters and kind of always have been. Catholics, on the other hand, for a long time had the reputation of being a swing vote. That is, they weren't reliably aligned with one party or the other, and therefore which way they went could determine the outcomes of elections. Now, to some extent, especially if we look at the overall Catholic vote, that's still true. But at least as far as we talk about the white Catholic vote, it is no longer the case. White Catholic voters today, you can pretty much pencil it in that around 60% of them are going to vote for the Republican candidate no matter what. And, I would just add this one other consideration, that if you dial down even further and look at how often these voters go to Mass, if we want to talk about white Catholic voters who go to Mass at least once a month, it's off the charts, right? I mean, I don't know exactly what the number was this time, but my guess is it was somewhere around 67, 68%. I mean, we're getting close to almost 3/4 of white Catholic voters who go to Mass regularly are going to vote for Republican candidates. And I want to emphasize, this is a phenomenon that predated Donald Trump. There's no reason to think it won't outlast Donald Trump. Now, on the whole, whether that is healthy or not for the political throw weight of the Catholic community in America, beyond my powers to say. All I will say is that I suspect that going forward, just as political tacticians today aren't really targeting the white evangelical vote because they know it's going to go Republican overwhelmingly, in the future, it will be less likely that campaigns are going to spend a lot of energy going after the white Catholic vote either, because they're going to know it's reliably going to go Republican no matter what they do. All right. Second, what are the implications of Trump's victory for U.S.-Vatican relations? Well, to a very great extent, this is fairly predictable, right? I mean, to some extent, it will be a repeat of the first Trump administration. That is, one can expect significant differences on a fairly wide range of issues, things including immigration, climate change, anti-poverty efforts, and so on. I mean, let's face it, in many ways, Donald Trump and Pope Francis represent fairly different views of the world, fairly different political agendas, and so on. Okay, so the divergences are fairly easy to handicap. Similarly, you know, the places in which the White House and the Vatican during a second Trump term may be able to come together are also fairly easy to anticipate. Abortion and the life issues. Now, that may be slightly more complicated than in the first Trump term because, Donald Trump, 2016 to 2020, was a robustly, strongly, some would say almost militantly pro-life figure. Now, the Donald Trump on the campaign trail leading into the 2024 elections, on the other hand, was to some extent a kinder, gentler figure when it came to abortion policy. That is, he said he was not going to sign a federal abortion ban, said he favored certain kinds of in vitro fertilization and stem cell research and so on. And so, all of this may suggest that he won't be quite as robustly pro-life as he once was. Remember, of course, Pope Francis, for all of his purported liberalism and progressivity, when it comes to life issues, particularly abortion, he in some ways is as tough as they come. He's described abortion as one of the gravest crimes. He's compared medical personnel who take part in abortions as equivalent, tantamount to hitmen, that is, to assassins. I mean, we may actually be witness to the irony that at least when it comes to the abortion issue and some other life issues, that Pope Francis actually profiles as the conservative and Donald Trump as, to some extent anyway, the moderate. Now, the one area in that broad zone of issues where one suspects the Trump White House and the Francis Vatican may have the most likelihood of intersecting is their opposition to so-called gender theory. That is, the idea that one's gender orientation is malleable, it's just a social construct. It can be a matter of personal choice. Both Pope Francis and President and candidate Trump have vigorously opposed that idea, very much believe that gender is a given in nature. That is, it's a kind of hard biological truth that needs to be respected. So at least there, one would think that Francis and Trump might be able to do business. Now, there is, however, one sort of surprising, semi-surprising zone where they might also be able to find some common cause, and that is the war in Ukraine. Because against conventional wisdom in much of the West, both Donald Trump and Pope Francis are on fairly friendly terms with Vladimir Putin of Russia. I mean, Trump's openness to Putin, his bromance with Putin is quite well known. Equally, Pope Francis, from the beginning of the war in Ukraine, has refused to explicitly condemn Vladimir Putin. He has even suggested that the West, particularly NATO expansionism towards the east, towards some of Russia's satellite states, may actually have helped create the conditions that prompted Russia to launch the invasion of Ukraine. Both Trump and Pope Francis, in their own ways, have suggested that the Western flow of arms to Ukraine have exacerbated this conflict. And both Trump and Pope Francis, in their own ways, have suggested that there is a need for a negotiated end to this conflict that may not necessarily involve Ukraine maintaining every square inch of territory it claimed before Russia invaded. So, all of that may suggest that, in some ways, against the instincts and the will of some of the other Western powers, ironically, these two guys who seem antipodes in so many ways, Trump and Francis, may be able to come together in terms of trying to propose a resolution to the Ukraine conflict with a combination of American hard power and Vatican soft power, that could prove to be fairly consequential. We will see, of course, as always. All right, third point this week. We have a situation now in which there is a president in the United States and a pope in Rome who, frankly, just don't seem like two peas in a pod. I mean, we've seen this show before, right? In the run-up to the 2016 election, Pope Francis publicly said that Donald Trump probably wasn't a Christian because of his desire to build a border wall with Mexico to keep the immigrants out. He said, Christians build bridges, not walls. And towards the end of the first the first Trump term, popes don't have more than one term of office, obviously, but towards the end of the first Trump term, there was a massive dispute over the Vatican's willingness to do business with China. President Trump's first Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, came to Rome and publicly warned that the Vatican was going to lose its moral authority if it continued to play footsie with communist China. And by the way, there's no sign that that dispute is going away. Just a couple days ago, while congratulating Donald Trump on his re-election, the Vatican's top diplomat, Italian Cardinal Pietro Parolin, nevertheless said, this is not going to change our line on China. He said, we're committed to it despite whatever opposition may come from America. So, those differences are going to be there. Now, the question is there anything that might pull in the opposite direction? Anything that might, mitigate some of those broad policy differences? And I would suggest, yeah, there is. And that is, who is Donald Trump going to choose as his ambassador to the Holy See for his second term? Let us remember, during his first term from 2016 to 2020, he nominated Callista Gingrich, the wife of former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. The Vatican was actually very pleased with that appointment. Why? Well, because in the Vatican, when they're evaluating, potential choices to be ambassadors, they don't really care what that person's politics are. They don't care what their life experience is. They really don't care even what their personal morality is. What they care about is whether that person has juice with the administration they represent. That is, what they want to know is, if we call up the ambassador and we say the Pope wants X, okay, is the ambassador going to be able to get that onto the radar screen of the president or prime minister they represent? Or are they going to be ignored? And, Callista, being the wife of Newt Gingrich, not only the former House Speaker, but a close Trump friend and advisor, the Vatican had the sense that they were being taken seriously, right? That Trump had sent someone who had access. And actually, during her term, Ambassador Gingrich was able to move the ball in pretty significant ways. She organized a number of events and engaged in a great deal of advocacy around issues such as human trafficking and also religious freedom. She organized a number of public events, but also behind the scenes was quite active in trying to be of assistance to the Vatican. So, for instance, if a priest or a nun needed help getting a visa into some sensitive area, she would be there to help out. If there was some question about trying to figure out what was going on the ground someplace that threatened Catholic interests, and perhaps, America would have some intelligence that might be useful there, she was, engaged in trying to do solids for the Vatican in that regard. I mean, in the end, and listen, of the 12 U.S. ambassadors to the Holy See, I've known 10 of them personally. And I've got a pretty good sense of the other two as well. In the end, I think you would probably have to say that Callista Gingrich was in the top third of most effective and consequential U.S. ambassadors to the Vatican. And to some extent, was able to take the sting out of broad policy issues with a robust commitment to just what you might call customer service, right? Like, dealing with these lower level, unspectacular kind of issues, concerns, requests the Vatican might bring forward. And so, my point simply is you can't make assumptions about what a relationship between a particular president and a particular pope is going to be like exclusively in the abstract. You also have to wait to see who they're going to put on the ground to help manage this relationship and what kind of skill set they might be able to bring to bear. So, I think all of us will be watching Trump's choice very, very closely. Probably we will get that nomination 2-3 months after Trump is sworn in January. It will be well worth watching, and of course, we'll have full coverage on Crux. All right. Finally, this week, I just want to offer a small dose of perspective for all those who were tempted to either elation or despair about the results of the American elections. And let's face it, elections do tend to foster a kind of absolutist psychology, don't they, right? I mean, people tend to think that, if one side wins, it's going to be nirvana. It's going to be a new golden age, that it will all be sweetness and light. And if the other side wins, it will be disaster and Armageddon, right? And it's understandable because political campaigns kind of promote thinking in those terms. But, the truth of it is that despite transitions from one leader to another, in many cases, what is more striking are the range of issues that remain the same in institutions, despite who happens to be in charge, rather than those things that are rejected, repealed, or changed, okay? Let me give you an example from recent experience on the Vatican front. So this past weekend, Pope Francis welcomed the Catholicos Patriarch of the Assyrian Church of the East, Mar Awa III, to the Vatican. And this was, in a way, a culmination of a more than 40-year journey of ecumenical reconciliation and detente between the Catholic Church and the Assyrian Church of the East. The Assyrian Church of the East is a descendant of one of the most ancient churches in the Christian world. And as I said, today it only counts about 400,000 followers. It's headquartered in Erbil in Iraq. But nevertheless, it has a mammoth symbolic significance because it represents one of the most important and sort of noble, distinguished, hallowed branches of early Christianity. So for some time now, it has been on this sort of path of increasing rapprochement, if you like, with Rome. This began under Pope John Paul II and reached a couple of high points under the Polish Pope. In 1994, the Catholic Church and the Assyrian Church of the East issued a common Christological declaration in which they proclaimed that Christological differences, which had once separated the two churches, basically amounted only to verbal disputes, and that they were now resolved, that the two churches acknowledged that each shared the same faith. Now, what makes that somewhat breathtaking is that the split between the rest of Christianity and the Church of the East goes all the way back to 431 and the Council of Ephesus, when Ephesus decided that the appropriate term for the Virgin Mary was Theotokos, Mother of God, and the Church of the East, following Nestorian, and who would give his name to the Nestorian theological stream, that the appropriate term was actually Christotokos, that is, not the Mother of God, but the Mother of Christ. This came before Okay, the rupture over the Council of Chalcedon, and later, 20 years later, after Ephesus. It came before the split between East and West in 1054. It came before the Protestant Reformation in 1517. It is the original rupture in the Christian family. And so the fact that in 1994, the two sides declared it basically over was a decision in some ways 1,500 years in the making. It was staggering. In 2001, the Vatican issued a statement saying that it was okay for Chaldean Catholics to receive communion under certain circumstances at masses celebrated by the Assyrian Church of the East, despite the fact that the Eucharistic prayers used by the Church of the East, the so-called Anaphori of Addai and Mari, does not contain the words of institution, those famous words, "This is my body and this is my blood," which Catholic theology for 1,500 years had held was absolutely essential to the validity of the sacrament. The Vatican under John Paul said, no, given the totality of what the Church of the East represents, it's okay. We're going to recognize the validity of their Eucharistic prayer regardless. Now, and by the way, that decision in 2001 was not only issued under John Paul II, but it was personally approved by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, who went on to become Pope Benedict XVI. So in a sense, it carried the approval of not one, but two popes, the present pope and the future pope. Now, that has continued under Pope Francis. As I said, the new Catholicos Patriarch of the Church of the East was in town this weekend. He was received by Pope Francis. And on that occasion, Pope Francis announced that he was adding a saint by the name of Saint Isaac of Nineveh, also known as Isaac the Syrian, who was a 7th century bishop in the Church of the East, highly venerated in their tradition for his spiritual and mystical writings. Pope Francis announced that he was adding him also to the Roman Martyrology, that is, to the official register of saints in the Catholic Church, too. Now, that's not utterly unprecedented. Not long ago, Pope Francis added 21 Coptic martyrs, that is, members of the Orthodox Coptic Church in Egypt who had been beheaded by ISIS in 2015. He added them to the Roman Martyrology, but it's certainly not something he does every day. And the choice of this particular figure was obviously intended as another gesture of outreach to the Assyrian Church of the East and another point on the compass towards full communion between the two churches. Now, my point is, this rapprochement between the Assyrian Church and the Catholic Church has now endured 3 changes of papacy: John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and now Francis. It's also endured 3 transitions in patriarchs on the Assyrian side. That's 6 different elections that have come and gone, and yet the commitment remains. My point, ladies and gentlemen, is that personalities, including the leaders, whether in the White House or in Rome or in Erbil or anywhere else, leaders and their personalities come and go. Institutions and their interests generally endure. So, no matter whether you were tempted right now to ecstasy or despair, I invite you to temper those reactions, realizing that yes, some things certainly hang on the question of who's in charge and who isn't, but it's not the end of the world or the birth of a new one. It is more marginal change where in many ways the things that truly matter will continue. All right, that is my word to the wise. Again, you can find full coverage of all these stories on the Crux site. Thank you for joining us. We will be back here, same bat week, same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, have a fantastic and blessed week. Towel down from the frenzy of the election, and we will talk to you again very soon.